So today we'll be discussing variations on Buddhism. Just as with all religions, there are various ways of interpreting, understanding, practicing each of these faiths depending upon your location, um, depending upon time period, etc., etc. And Buddhism is no different. We discussed, or at least we mentioned, the three major types at the beginning of our lectures on Buddhism. There's Theravada Buddhism, there's Mahayana Buddhism, there's Vajrayana Buddhism. Let's compare the first two first. The Mahayana folks oftentimes think of the Theravada branch of Buddhism as being a small vessel, a small raft, and hence they often label them as being Hinayana, meaning little raft. And the idea here is to go back to the analogy of trying to escape suffering or trying to leave suffering. The Mahayana folks see the Theravada branch of Buddhism as having a smaller vessel with which to help humanity escape suffering, while they see themselves, the Mahayana branch sees themselves as being more inclusive, as emphasizing helping more people. So they see themselves as the bigger raft. Obviously, the Theravada branch of Buddhism prefers to label themselves and think of themselves as being Theravada Buddhists, right? The way of the elders, a little more positive connotation. And within Theravada Buddhism, there's going to be an emphasis on the Buddha achieving enlightenment. While for the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, the emphasis isn't on achieving enlightenment necessarily, but on what the Buddha did afterwards, right? Coming back to help others. Now, when we take a look at the Theravada branch of Buddhism, we see a propensity to follow the Pali Canon strictly and believing this is the best source of the Buddhist teachings, while the Mahayana branch believes that there are teachings from the Buddha that can be attained outside of the Pali Canon. For the Theravada branch of Buddhism, when they look at what it means to become enlightened, what it means to have sat under the Bodhi tree, and what occurred to the Buddha at that point in time, the emphasis is going to be on attaining wisdom. So enlightenment is about attaining wisdom, Bodhi, right? Hence the Bodhi tree. For the Mahayana branch, enlightenment is about cultivating and developing compassion. So the enlightenment that the Buddha attained wasn't just of knowledge, it was about cultivating the heart in a way to be more compassionate towards others. So what is the aim? What's the goal? Within Theravada Buddhism, the game is to become the aim is to become an arhat, which means to attain nirvana, attain liberation from suffering, attain escape from suffering. It's an individual thing, right? I do my practices for myself so that I can become an arhat. With the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, the goal or aim is to be a bodhisattva. And this is a person who attains enlightenment not to stay in nirvana, but in order to come back and help others also attain enlightenment. We're going to primarily discuss Mahayana today and Vajrayana, since a lot of what we discussed already within Buddhism applies to Theravada. Within the Mahayana tradition, there is this story of how the Buddha brought his students to a muddy field, and within this mush, there was a single flower, and the Buddha picked it up and would hand it to his students. Being good students, they figured this must be a lesson from the Buddha. So they would stare at the flower and try to explain what the lesson might be. Right? This flower represents represents wisdom and the natural intelligence of the earth, or somebody might say this flower represents compassion and how this gives life to other things within the ecosystem. So they would go down the line, and each of the students would grab the flower and then try to espouse what sort of lesson they believe the Buddha was teaching them. Well, as the story goes, the flower ends up with the last student, and rather than speaking or giving some sort of verbal explanation for the lesson being taught, the student begins to laugh. And the Buddha acknowledges that that last student is the only individual who understood the lesson. Now, what does this mean? This seems to point towards an emphasis on knowledge and wisdom that's nonverbal, that can't be expressed with language. And we see this emphasized with the idea of sunyata. Sunyata is a concept of emptiness. It is the experience of being clear and open. In this sense, you can think of your mind as sometimes being clouded by thought. And that doesn't allow us to see or experience reality as it is. But every once in a while, maybe you've experienced it for yourself, where your mind clears, your mind opens, and instead of being aware of the clouds, it actually sees what's behind the clouds. This clearing, this opening of the clouds, experiencing what's beyond them, that's sunyata. So think of any time when you've been trying to solve a problem, or when you've been trying to deal with a situation and your mind becomes muddy. There might have been a moment where the mud clears, or when your thoughts dissipate and you're able to see things more clearly. That openness of thought, that openness of awareness, that sunyata. So within the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, there's this emphasis on trying to attain this experience, this clarity of mind. One way to describe what this means is to think of it as being aware of an experience without your conditioned mind imposing meaning on it. It will often impose meaning on our experience using language. This is that is this. And we label our experience. The idea of sunyata is to experience what's in front of us without the labels. Because the labels are words, and the words come from us. They come from our language. And that means all those words are tied to other words. So we are going to, every time we describe or label our experience, we're automatically tying it down or weighing it down to things that we've already defined for ourselves. So there's all these connotations and connections. That may not be what's actually in front of us. Whatever's in front of us, it is what it is. So that pure connection, that pure identification, or that pure awareness of what's in front of us without our baggage of predetermined vocabulary, that's sunyata. We've looked at this before. With this particular puzzle, two men are found dead in the cabin in their woods. What prevented a lot of us from seeing the solution, from having that clarity of mind to experience the solution, was the fact that once we describe the scenario with these words, our minds are conditioned to understand these words a certain way. All of our common understanding of those terms, you can think of as being the clouds that get in the way of seeing how things are in and of themselves. To get past that conditioned thinking, to get past our conditioned understanding of something, to see something as it really is, that's sunyata. So sunyata is awareness without the mind necessarily imposing meaning upon the experience, judging it as good or bad, this or that. This is a very prominent ideal within Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism, in a nutshell, emphasizes simplicity, emphasizes serenity, and it emphasizes this clarity of thought that brings about a epiphany, that where you come to a quick understanding all of a sudden out of nowhere of something. Maybe when you had seen this puzzle that we looked at for the first time, maybe some of you had this experience where once you were relaxed, it came to you out of nowhere. Oh, the answer to the puzzle is. That experience of having that sudden insight is referred to as satori. So within Zen Buddhism, we have this theme of trying to cultivate simplicity, serenity, in our lives in order to attain experiences of Satori. Hence, we have a simple symbol for Zen Buddhism, an open or not complete circle, room for things to come into it. So maybe you're familiar with Zen Buddhist aesthetic, right? The clarity of rooms, the simplicity of decoration, the serenity of nature. So Zen Buddhism originated in China in the 6th century, and Zen is actually the Japanese pronunciation of what in Chinese would be more like Chan. So Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. Within China, this Buddhism was heavily influenced by Taoism, and the influence of Taoism into Buddhism has this out has this product, right? Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism is the result of this combination. And within Zen Buddhism, there are a few key terms I'd like you to know. One is Zazen, which refers to a seated meditation, like in the image here. Koans, which we'll take a look in a second, are practices. They're stories and puzzles that Zen Buddhists will use to try to help cultivate a mind that's better able to experience sunyata and then have those moments of satori. The idea within these koans, these puzzles, are to try to stop the mind from imposing meaning on what it experiences so that our mind is better able to just simply experience what's in front of us. We'll look through several of these in a second. Sanzen refers to a private session between the student and a master, and the Sanzen will often include these koans. And as we mentioned a second ago, Satori refers to these flashes of insight, these moments of clarity where an idea or a realization comes to us. So let's take a look at various koans. One of the more famous Zen koans is the following. You can make the sound of 2 hands clapping. Now, what is the sound of 1 hand clapping? I'll give you a second to ruminate over this. As Stanford psychologist Robert Ornstein writes, he sees these koans as serving the purpose of stopping the rational mind from grappling with something. So our rational mind likes to analyze, tear apart, bit by bit, situations, circumstances, in order to better understand it. The problem is that means our rational mind is inherently imposing meaning upon all of these parts. It's inherently trying to fit what it sees with what it already knows. This is what understanding means. If I asked you, what's a car? You would describe a car, and it's based upon what you already know of a car. And then when you see something new, like if I give you a new tool you had never seen before, let's say a pair of dice that's meant to be hung by the mirror. If you've no experience about what that is, I would describe that to you in relationship to your understanding of a car. So to understand something new, we're always relating it to what we already know. The problem is, what if what we already know isn't exactly how it is? What if there's more to understand about something than what we already know? Within Zen Buddhism, the idea is that maybe we can stop the rational mind from automatically coming to an understanding of what's in front of us. And through that stopping of the mind, we give room, right? Sunyata, we open up room for the mind to come up with a solution, idea, concept, epiphany that it wouldn't have come up with if we were clinging on to what we think we already knew. And you can go back to the story of the 2 men found dead in the woods. Because of the rational mind, we piece out the idea of 2 men, we piece out the idea of woods, we have an idea of what a cabin is, and our rational mind uses what we think we already know of the situation to try to make sense of it. Did they die from a fire? Did they die because they killed each other? Were they attacked by a bear, right? All of these sorts of ideas come from what we think we already know of the scenario. For Zen koans, The idea is maybe to stop that from happening. Stop imposing what we think we already know onto what's in front of us. So maybe you experience that with this koan. Let's see what happens in the next one. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. This is something we may discuss in our weekly live conferences at the end of the week. Another koan. What was your original face? The one you had before your parents gave birth to you. Again, all these koans are meant, supposedly, according to some people, are meant to halt the rational mind from going about thinking the way it usually thinks, in order to leave space to think differently. Sometimes thinking differently is what's needed in order to see something like a solution or a creative idea. Now, when this is often given to students, the responses to the koans aren't necessarily meant to be verbal. You don't think about the koan and go, the meaning of this koan is, and explain. Oftentimes, what's really the answer to the koan is something nonverbal, is something you physically do, right? Hence, when we think about the story of the flower sermon story, notice that all the students tried to explain with words what the lesson was that was being given to them by the Buddha through the flower. Yet it was only the last person, the last student that the Buddha said understood the lesson. But that last person didn't say anything with words, they simply laughed. So it's through an experience, it's through an expression that maybe, oftentimes, the student is best able to express what the lesson is that the master is trying to teach them. So, stereotypically, you might see students do a variety of actions. Once they figure out, once they come to once they have a Satori experience of the Zen koan lesson, what the lesson is that's being given to them through the koan, they might do things like jump up and down, or laugh hysterically, or pound their chest, or a variety of other physical sorts of manifestations. You can relate to this, possibly, by thinking about our whole notion of logos versus mythos. Through the Zen koan, it might be that what's trying to be relayed to the student isn't a declarative fact, isn't some sort of knowledge of fact. This is how life is like. Always be careful to watch out for. Maybe what's being expressed instead is knowledge of acquaintance. Maybe what we're supposed to get is some sort of experience. And the only way to relate the experience is to live, right? To do something in the world. This could be why so many times the solution to the lesson of a koan, or the response, the proper response, isn't to say this is that, but simply to act a certain way. There is a famous Zen proverb about the nature of enlightenment. It said, before enlightenment, what do? Well, you chop wood and you carry water. This is the normal life. And then after enlightenment, what happens? What do you do now? Well, it's said that now, after you've attained enlightenment, you still chop wood, you still carry water. So enlightenment is this internal sort of transformation. It's an internal change, an internal happening that affects your life, but you still live in the world. The enlightened person within Mahayana doesn't escape reality. They don't escape life. They simply live their lives, possibly more elegantly, in a way that's more conducive to happiness. The last branch that we'll talk about is Vajrayana Buddhism, and this is often referred to as a more energetic or a more direct approach to escaping suffering. At least within the Vajrayana tradition, they see themselves this way. And when we think Vajrayana, you can think Tibetan Buddhism, right? So, as opposed to the two branches we looked at previously, where there's an emphasis on cultivating awareness, emphasis of peace of mind. Uh, the Vajrayana branch of Buddhism there's an emphasis on action. There's an emphasis on not escaping internal turmoil, but to go into it deeper, thereby transforming it from within, as opposed to seeing it from above. So when we take a look at various artifacts from Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana tradition, we see a dramatic difference. So compare this to what we saw a second ago with Zen Buddhism. Much more colorful, much more bright, much more engaging to the senses. And all of these things are meant to activate energies within us that can help us escape suffering. So Tibetan Buddhism originated obviously in Tibet, 8th century, and it's often referred to as the third turning. So remember back to our analogy of the wheel of Dharma, wheel of knowledge in the Eightfold Path. Both Vajrayana Buddhism and both Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism are said to be different turnings, different ways of escaping ways of escaping suffering. And the Tibetan Buddhists see themselves as the third turning. And when we take a look at the beliefs and practices that make up Tibetan Buddhism, a lot of them seem very foreign. They seem very much different, very different than what we talked about with the first two branches of Buddhism. And there's a reason for this. When we look at Tibetan Buddhism, there's lots of influences, heavy influences, that we don't necessarily see in the first two branches. There's the indigenous spirituality, indigenous religion within the Tibetan region, right? This is the Bon tradition. So when we see Buddhism going into Tibet, Bon, which was already there, starts to become melded with Buddhism. Plus, there is a heavier influence of beliefs and practices that we would normally associate with Hinduism. Now, within this tradition, they'll say that a lot of what they believe are esoteric teachings. These are teachings that are more secretive, or that are below the surface, right? Not as obvious as some of the teachings we see from the Pali Canon and from the more exoteric sources within the Mahayana tradition. What's the secret? Well, what we see is an emphasis on metaphysics. Now, what we mean by that is when we took a look at Buddhism prior to Vajrayana, we didn't really discuss things like the afterlife. We didn't really discuss things like spirits or souls. We didn't discuss the idea of reincarnation like we did with Hinduism. But within Tibetan Buddhism, there is a big emphasis on spirits and on moving energies and on the afterlife. There's a big mythology about dying and then going to a bardo, which is this in-between state between life and death, and you ride the ship within the bardo, transports you to your new life after reincarnation. The Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibetan Buddhism, is said to be a reincarnation of previous Dalai Lamas. So our current Dalai Lama is thought to be the 14th reincarnation. So what we see now is more of an emphasis on working with the energies of the body, or the energies within our lives. So our frustrations, our anxieties, or our sexual urges, or all of these are different energies within our body. And rather than trying to be simply mindful of them and try to escape them or transcend them, within Tibetan Buddhism, we are asked to delve deeper into them, to make use of them, to help us to help transform us from being caught in suffering to being in nirvana. So you might have heard terms like chakras, right? These are different energy centers. So for us to liberate ourselves from suffering, there are various things that we can do to tap into, to go further deeply into these energies. Various rituals, various chanting, there's pilgrimages, there's various mantras. different hand gestures, right? Mudras, various imagery and patterns, these mandalas like we see on this carpet in the image here. There's even practices that are meant to have us become more in tune with sexual desire, sexual urges. We don't have time to go into detail about how this works, except to say that rather than being succumb and to these energies, rather than suffering because the energies kind of trap us into suffering, what we see within the Vajrayana tradition is the notion that if we go deeper into the suffering, we get to understand it better. Going deeper into the energy, the pain, we get to really know it. So that rather than having our mind preoccupied with judgments and thoughts about why am I feeling this? This is stupid. I can't believe this is happening to me. We simply feel the actual pain. And sometimes when we feel the actual pain, feel the actual energy, it's really not as bad as a suffering that we endure by getting caught up in all our judgments and thoughts about the pain, about the suffering. This is the best that I can do to explain this sort of approach to escaping suffering from the Tibetan point of view. So, just to talk about Buddhism in China for a second, the Mahayana tradition, as we mentioned earlier, right? Mahayana tradition gets fused with lots of cultures and traditions already in China as Buddhism goes through China. So there's a variety of various practices, beliefs that are all labeled under this big umbrella of Buddhism within China. But as you know, through maybe experience with friends or family or with people that you interact with, there's lots of things about Buddhism that we haven't discussed, whether it's use of incense, whether it's these extravagant altars. Sometimes there's an altar, a single altar with a larger statue Buddha, and behind it, are several other smaller Buddhas. Right? Sometimes people have offerings, as you see in the imagery, offerings of food, offerings of drink within these altars. Now, all of these various traditions, right? You can see them coming from indigenous uh, um, spirituality that existed within China already. So the various different types of Buddhism we see in China as a result are listed here for you. And there are various individuals, various Buddhist teachers that are associated with each of these that we won't have time to discuss. And just like Tibetan Buddhism, where we identified Bon and Hinduism as having influenced it, within all these various Chinese forms of Buddhism, we see various influences from different types of indigenous cultures. So the use of incense had been in China long before Buddhism. The use of altars with um, that provide where we provide food and drink, that had been in China prior to Buddhism. One statue, one image that I'd like to discuss before leaving our discussion of Mahayana Buddhism is this one. If you go to Asian grocery stores, if you go to uh, various temples, you might see this figure of the Buddha. Now, this figure is strikingly different from other statues of the Buddha that we've seen in other images so far in class. You notice it has a larger belly. This version of the Buddha is always smiling. This image isn't of the first Buddha. It's not an image of Siddhartha. Right? This is an image of somebody else. It's an image of a figure named Budai or Hotai, depending if you're Japanese or Chinese. And Budai is said to have existed around 800 AD. And the story behind Bodai is of an individual who had achieved enlightenment and was giddy and was joyful as a result of achieving this enlightenment. Hence, they're seen as laughing all the time. And you can maybe come to an understanding of what the symbolism might be of having a large belly. It might refer to being full. It might be referred to being satiated, right? Having achieved satisfaction in one's life. Various things that I'm sure you can think of. Now, though this image, this figure, may not have been the first Buddha, may not have been Siddhartha Gautama, the Bodhi or Hotai may in fact be a Buddha. So within the Mayan tradition, there's the idea that there's several different Buddhas. And Buddhas simply refers to people that have attained enlightenment. So it might be even better to say several bodhisattvas, right? Okay, so let's summarize Buddhism. So just like with Hinduism, let's ask some basic questions just so we can contextualize and get our hands around how to understand Buddhism. What's the ultimate for Buddhism? Well, it kind of depends. It kind of depends. For some people, the ultimate is nirvana, achieving this escape from suffering. For others, it might be enlightenment, coming to the realization, coming to an understanding. Well, then what's the human condition? How does Buddhism describe our life on the planet, on earth? Again, it depends. For some people, the human condition is dukkha, right? The human condition is suffering. For others, the real condition, the real heart of our problem is ignorance, being unaware. How do we transcend this condition? How do we escape suffering? How do we escape ignorance? Again, several different answers to this. One is to think of the Eightfold Path. We can escape suffering by following the Eightfold Path. Another is, since the problem is ignorance, the solution is to attain clarity, to attain openness of perception, openness of mind, so that we can have awareness of reality as it is. Now, the question for you is, what is your takeaway from our discussion of Buddhism? What is the one or the few concepts or ideas that you'll hold on to as being key to what Buddhism is based upon what you've been exposed to so far? For some, it might be the notion that happiness isn't dictated by your circumstances. Your well being, your happiness, isn't the result of things outside of your control. Instead, Buddhism seems to say it is an inside job. You can, depending on the choices you make and the thoughts you entertain and where you pay attention, you can dictate your own happiness. You can choose to be happy. Maybe what comes to you is the notion that the quality of life is equivalent to the quality of your mind. So while we often spend so much time in our lives trying to adjust or alter what's on the outside of us, right? How we look, the possessions we have, maybe what we should focus on is developing the skills of the mind, the ability to focus on what we choose to focus on, the ability um, to enter into equanimity, the ability to be mindful. One thing to ask before we leave is, do you see or hear any resemblances between what you've learned about Buddhism with other religions you're familiar with? You should be able to draw some parallels with what we've already discussed with Hinduism, the idea of suffering and escape from suffering. Maybe you can even see Buddhism as kind of a Raja Yoga, right? A path to liberation through meditation. Maybe you can even relate it to the Abrahamic traditions and ideas we might have about living life on earth or about kingdom of heaven, being on earth, or other concepts you might be familiar with. When we get together over our live conference, we will discuss a Zen koan, and I'll ask you once again to try to imagine what the world would feel like to you if this was your mythology, if this was the story, the fundamental story that through which you experience the world.